If I can have your attention, we want to get started. It's a pleasure to host this event, and in cooperation with many people in Congress. I want to thank Senator Cruz for being here. I understand some of your colleagues are on the way, but first one in, and we appreciate it. On many other issues when it comes to Israel in general and Jerusalem specifically. So I want to thank you for your staunch support. It's a pleasure for me to be hosting this event for Dory, both because of the person and because of the subject. First, the person. Dory, as probably, I see a lot of familiar faces here. As you know, is a first-rate scholar. He runs the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, which is one of the most prominent think tanks in Israel, and does countless seminars, writes countless articles, but he has also written a number of books on Iran's nuclear program, on Saudi Arabia, on the United Nations. That would have, I think, forced me to give up writing books after something like that. And of course, on Jerusalem. I mean, there's very few topics where Dory's not an expert. And the Prime Minister, every time, so many times we'd be having a conversation, and when there was a question, he said, ask Dory, ask Dory, ask Dory. So he's one of Israel's leading experts on such a vast range of topics. And of all those topics, probably the one that you know best is this one, is Jerusalem. And of course, you'll see that in his presentation. He knows a lot about its history, of course, knows a lot about Israel's history as a guarantor of religious freedom within the city and how rare that is historically. And I think it's something that a lot of people don't understand because we tend to take things for granted. And the fact that Israel has been there has made a profound difference in the lives of a lot of people in the region, and has preserved freedom of worship for the three great monotheistic faiths and beyond. In addition to being a first-rate scholar, he is also a first-rate diplomat. He was a diplomatic advisor to the Prime Minister. Actually, he's been with the Prime Minister longer than me in one capacity or the other. There's very few of those people I can point to. He was our ambassador at the United Nations in the late 90s. He was the Director General of our foreign ministry, and he understood and understands, as the Prime Minister does, the importance of leveraging Israel's rising power, its military power and its economic power, and leveraging that to change Israeli diplomacy. And we are now in a period where Israel's diplomacy is flourishing as never before, and the reason is because Israel has become a much stronger country. While a lot of people were not paying attention, or while a lot of people thought that the key for us having a flourishing of our diplomacy was to make concessions to our Palestinian neighbors, the Prime Minister was busy building the strength of the country, its military strength, its economic strength, and the firm belief that by making Israel stronger, we're actually bringing peace closer. And Dory played a key role in that as Director General in Africa, deepening Israel's ties with countries there, in Asia, and in the Middle East. And maybe that would be a future book when the statute of limitations, I think, runs out on that. Maybe you could talk about all of your contacts in the Middle East. In addition to being a first-rate scholar and a first-rate diplomat, he is also a first-rate mensch, which is a note to all the great scholars. I see a few of them here. I don't know if I see many diplomats here. You haven't been accused like me as being a great diplomat, right? So I say that with Senator Cruz. But note to all great scholars and great diplomats, you can also be a great mensch as well. Now, I've spoken a little bit about the person. Let's speak about the subject matter. Jerusalem, which for both Dory and me is also the city where we both call home. This presentation today comes at a perfect time after President Trump's historic decision on Jerusalem, I should say decisions on Jerusalem, both to recognize Jerusalem as our capital and announce the moving of the embassy, and also before the launch of a potential peace initiative. The historic decision has definitely put Jerusalem in the news in the last few weeks. There have been 4 historic decisions, historic international decisions in the history of Zionism. The first was 100 years ago in the Balfour Declaration, recognizing the right of the Jewish people to a national home. The second occurred slightly over 70 years ago at the United Nations, in a brief moment where the United Nations had some moral clarity, and it had to do with a lot of great power politics and a Soviet decision, because they wanted to get the British out of the Middle East, to vote for the establishment of a Jewish state. But that partition resolution was the second major decision. The third was President Truman's decision 11 minutes after Ben-Gurion declared a state to recognize the state of Israel. And the fourth was President Trump's decision a couple months ago to recognize Jerusalem as our capital. And as I have said over these last few weeks, that deserves a round of applause. I said over these last few weeks that we Jews have a very, very long memory. We remember Cyrus, the great Persian king that enabled the Jews to go and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem 2,500 years ago. I don't know if the Persians remember Cyrus, but the Jews remember Cyrus. And this decision, it's hard for people to understand that, because we get stuck in the sound and fury of our daily lives and all of the politics and partisanship and everything else. This is a decision that's going to be remembered for the ages. It's hard for us who are here living through it to understand how powerful a decision it was. And we are deeply appreciative of President Trump for that decision, and for all the members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who supported that for many, many years. But President Trump's decision, in my view, also helps advance the cause of peace, because it gets to the heart of why we don't have peace. Now, some think we don't have peace because of this or that final status issue. And they usually think of the four great issues in Jerusalem and refugees and territory and security, and they think if we can only tweak it exactly right, we get the right formula, that's how we'll have peace. But the reason why Israel does not have peace with the Palestinians is not because of a final status issue, it's because of a first status issue. It's because of a refusal of the Palestinians to recognize the legitimacy, the right of the Jewish people to a state in our homeland in any boundary. That's what the conflict has been about from the beginning. That was the conflict in 1947, when you had that UN resolution of two states for two peoples, a Jewish state and an Arab state. There were no refugees, which were a product of Israel's war of independence. There were no post-67 settlements, which a lot of people, especially in recent years, have begun to believe that this is the reason why we have a conflict, forgetting about a half century of conflict that came before. It's the refusal to recognize a Jewish right of self-determination. And the Palestinians' narrative is very simple. They say, we stole their house. That's their narrative. That's what they believe, and that's what they teach their children. Now, if you believe that, if they believe that, then you can offer any percentage you want to the Palestinians. You can offer 99% of it back, and they won't take it. And by 99%, I'm not talking about the 99% of the Judea and Samaria or the West Bank. I'm talking about 99% of Israel. You could offer it back. But if they think you stole their house, they won't take it. If they think the Jewish people have no right to be there, they are going to reject it. And that's also why the Palestinians constantly try to deny any historical connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. Because to admit that there is this connection, which is something that Dory's going to get into, is to admit that the Jewish people are not foreign colonialists in the land of Israel. It would make clear that Israel for the Jewish people is not India for the British, or Algeria for the French, or the Congo for the Belgians. This is the land of our ancestors. It's where the patriarchs of the Jewish people prayed. It's where our prophets preached. It's where our kings ruled. And the second they would admit that there is a historic connection, it would mean that the Jewish people are in Israel not merely by might, but by right. And to admit that would make the whole edifice of Palestinian rejectionism collapse. Frankly, the international community does not understand this at all. The people who deal with this day after day, month after month, year after year, don't understand this at all. And that's why they constantly focus on the wrong thing, which ends up not moving the ball down the field. I'll give you a personal story that happened to me. A few years ago, I won't name names, but it was before a speech that the Prime Minister was going to give to the United Nations. And the United States had just tried to launch a new political process, and they were trying to get the parties to engage. And I met with a leading envoy of the United States in Jerusalem, and the purpose of our meeting was he wanted to make sure that the upcoming speeches at the United Nations would not derail the process that they were starting. And so he came to me thinking that I might have a hand in what the Prime Minister would say at the United Nations. He was asking me, what would you like to see and hear from President Abbas? What would you like to hear him say in his United Nations speech? And he was telling me what they would like to hear the Prime Minister say, which I actually thought was a very good exercise and very smart, because in previous years, the UN speeches had sort of ratcheted things up, and he was trying to de-escalate it, make sure that it would be a minor speed bump, and they could get about the process of bringing the sides together. So it was a good idea. So he asked me what I wanted. And I said something very simple. Look, I said he's not going to recognize a Jewish state at the United Nations. He hasn't done it yet. I don't think he's going to do it there, but here's what I asked. I want President Abbas to say that the Jews are a people and not just a religion. And the difference is religions don't have rights of self-determination, peoples do. And the second thing is I want him to recognize some historic connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. Historically, don't talk about 48, don't talk about 67, talk about the past. Talk about how Jews have turned towards Jerusalem in prayer. Talk about something connecting the Jewish people to this land, because if the Jews are a people, and if Jews have a history in the land, that's the predicate for recognizing the Jews having a right to self-determination in that land. And he said to me, and this is what surprised me, he said to me, well, that seems reasonable. I think that's doable. No, that's what he told me. I think that's doable. And I told him, you're wrong. It is very reasonable, and it's completely not doable. But good luck. He says, no, I think it's doable. And what shocked me is that this is a person who's written multiple books about the conflict, but simply did not know how important these ideological issues are. And this is what it's all about. This is what the conflict is all about. And of course, a week later, he called me and said, you were right. They're not willing to do it. And we went on with I guess they went on with the process of not understanding what this conflict is about, and everyone continues to move ahead. Dealing with this Palestinian rejectionism is critical if you are going to advance peace. And the rejectionism is strongest and, of course, most absurd when it comes to Jerusalem. And you see evidence of this rejectionism everywhere. You see it in UNESCO decisions that deny a connection between the Jews and their holy sites. You know, the temple is in Jerusalem 1,500 years before the birth of Muhammad, rejected. Makes no difference. You hear it in the Palestinian claims that are repeated all the time by all sorts of characters, that we are Judaizing Jerusalem. This is one of my favorite expressions. It's like saying the Chinese are Sinifying Beijing, or the Russians are trying to Russify Moscow. And it's ridiculous. We are Judaizing Jerusalem. Hello? What does that mean? But they say this. You heard it in Arafat's statement to President Clinton at Camp David, that there was never a temple on the Temple Mount. He said that. I don't know whether he believes it or not, but he said it. And you hear it, of course, in Abu Mazen's refusal. You got to look very careful at the words that they say in their speeches. Refusal to recognize this connection between the Jews as a nation, because we are not just a faith, we are a people with a right to self-determination. The refusal of them to recognize any connection. And to say that there is no connection between the Jews and Jerusalem is the equivalent of saying that the world is flat. And it's clear to me, as I explain why the Palestinians do this. They make these outrageous claims because to admit this connection would deal a blow to this edifice of Palestinian rejectionism. And ground zero for that rejectionism is Jerusalem. So I totally understand why the Palestinians are doing it. The question is why the world tolerates it and even applauds it. Literally sometimes applauds it. You remember that scene from December 2016 at the UN Security Council, where they applauded a decision that effectively says that the Western Wall is occupied Palestinian territory. There are very few times in my adult life that I've been sickened by something that I've seen. You know, my expectations are pretty low when it comes to international politics and diplomacy. It was the rejoicing and the applause over this decision that denies all of our history that I found to be, I felt sorry for them. And I was thinking about all the years, if we added up all the years of those capitals, of those states, would they equal the 3,000 years that Jews have been turning in prayer to Jerusalem? So the important thing to understand is to advance peace, you must confront this Palestinian rejectionism. And that is precisely what President Trump did when he recognized Jerusalem as our capital. It's shock therapy for Palestinian rejectionism. And it's actually, in my view, one of the first positive things that have been done to advance peace in decades. And the fact that others have followed, and Guatemala has announced, and other countries, I think, hopefully will be announcing soon, that just makes it even more positive. And I understand that it's going to take some time for the dust to settle, but I have no doubt that President Trump's announcement will ultimately be seen as a historic turning point in the advance of peace, if you understand what I said of why we don't have a peace. By recognizing the Jews' history in Jerusalem, President Trump laid an important cornerstone for peace. And events like this one, which educate people about that history, become the mortar that can help lay the next building block for peace. So thank you, Dory, for your efforts to help lay the foundations for a lasting peace. And please join me in welcoming Ambassador Dory Gold.